The rise of the religious elites started with Esau's descendants mixing with the children of Jacob. They became a central force in Jerusalem, steering its spiritual and political landscape. But the question remains, who are the descendants of these figures today? We're continuing our discussion about how Esau infiltrated various nations by positioning himself in the ruling classes, even in Judea. We're going to focus on the ethnic composition of Judea in the 1st century AD to determine how many of its inhabitants were actual descendants of Jacob before we talk about the religious sect of the Pharisees. Many believe that they disappeared from history, but credible academic and historical sources state that the Pharisees survived the destruction of Jerusalem and that their surviving teachers became the rabbis who produced the Mishnah and later the Talmud. This is important because, as discussed previously, there was a mixed multitude in Judea in the times leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and many of those folks took on our identity. So in the ancient texts, you'll see that Judeans, Jews, Judaism, Israelite, Yehudi, Yehuda, and Judaios were used interchangeably, but at the end of the day, this is the group many equate with the ancient people. So we have to recognize the distinctions if we're going to interpret the historical records correctly. So who were the true Israelites? We're going to read some excerpts from this article regarding the population in Judea. And just FYI, I'm going to be reading the text as is as I go through certain articles for ease of understanding and so that you can see how they muddied the waters. I want you to see why it's so important for us to be able to differentiate between the various groups living in the land at that time. This says, determining the exact number of those in 1st century Judea who were of pure Israelite descent is nearly impossible due to multiple factors, including forced conversions, intermarriage, and migration. By the time of Messiah and the early church, the Jewish identity had shifted from being strictly ethnic to incorporating those who had adopted Jewish customs and laws, regardless of lineage. This goes on to talk about the forced conversions and political expansions. It says the Hasmonean dynasty played a major role in reshaping the demographics of Judea. Under John Hyrcanus, the Hasmoneans expanded Jewish-controlled territories and forcibly converted various neighboring peoples to include the Edomites and the Itureans. Although these groups adopted Jewish customs and laws, many were not of the lineage of Jacob, but were instead descendants of Esau or Ishmael. Also, you had the Hellenistic and Roman influences. Judea was under the influence of Greek and Roman culture, leading to significant intermarriage and assimilation. Urban centers such as Jerusalem, Caesarea, and Sepphoris housed populations that included Greeks, Romans, and other non-Israelites. This mixture further blurred the distinction between those who were true descendants of Jacob and those who had integrated into Jewish society. Now let's look at the role of the Samaritans. It says the Samaritans who lived in the northern region of Samaria claimed descent from Israel, particularly the northern tribes. However, many Jews considered them to be of mixed lineage due to intermarriage with non-Israelite peoples following the Assyrian conquest of 722 BC. Their presence in 1st century Palestine further complicated the ethnic landscape. Also, by the 1st century AD, many Jews had already migrated to places like Babylon, Egypt, especially Alexandria, and throughout the Roman Empire. At the same time, various peoples had moved into Judea, further diluting the Israelite bloodline. However, there is historical evidence that many ancient writers maintained awareness of ancestral distinctions even after other groups joined the Judean society. Herod's Idumean ancestry is one example. As an Idumean, he became king in Judea. So Israelite and Judean or Jew are not always identical categories. Author Steve Mason, a scholar specializing in ancient Jewish history, wrote an article called Jews, Judeans, Judaizing Judaism, Problems of Categorization in Ancient History. The article addresses the terminology and categorization of the word Jews in the ancient world, particularly in Persian and Greco-Roman contexts. He argues that in antiquity there was no modern concept of Judaism as a religion, but rather a distinct ethnic group called the Judaioi or Yehudim, with its own laws, traditions, and customs. Let's read some excerpts from the article. He says, our first task is to understand why a term that bears such enormous weight in scholarly discourse has such an elusive history in ancient texts. Translators have not been as reticent as the ancients, but occasionally supply Judaism or the Jewish religion where the terms are absent from the text. They do this, for example, where conversion is the issue. Just pause and think on that. He says they do this where conversion is the issue. It says, yet Josephus's terminology comes from a different conceptual framework, as we shall see. The virtual absence of Judeos from non-Christian Greek and Latin authors, all Gentiles, and all Judeoi with the exception of 2 small texts and 2 late inscriptions already indicates that the term's meaning or connotations restricted opportunities for its use. It could not, therefore, have meant the Judaism that we so readily employ. Now we're going to look at Hartman's commentary on Steve Mason's article. He says that quotation, the quotation that we just read, is part of Steve Mason's larger argument that modern scholars often project the modern concept of Judaism backward into antiquity when the ancient evidence does not necessarily support it. He says Mason is observing that the Greek word Judaioi, usually translated Judaism, is actually rare in ancient literature outside a limited set of texts. If it truly meant what we mean today by Judaism, meaning a major well-known religion, analogous to Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, etc., we would expect ancient writers to use it much more frequently, yet they generally did not. So Mason asks, if ancient people rarely used the word, maybe it did not mean what modern people assume it meant. He goes on to tell us that the word inform indicates a person of Judea, a Judean. It bears precisely the same relationship to the name of the homeland. For example, if one asks where a Babylonian or Egyptian or Syrian or Parthian was from, in what laws and customs they had been educated, the answer was apparent: in their ethnic land. So he says, if you were to ask, where are Jews from? You would have to associate the name with a place. He goes on to say that even in Israel, many Jews consider themselves to be from Poland, Russia, Yemen, or Iraq, and some preserve Ashkenazi or Sephardic traditions in dress, diet, outlook, and speech. It says since 1948, it has been possible for Jews also to be from Israel, but the ethnicon that corresponds to this homeland is Israeli, not Jew. Since the modern English Jew does not mean of Judea as Judaioi did, the ancient term is more faithfully rendered as Judean. So it goes on to tell us that Shea Cohen has located the crucial conditions of change from ethnos to religion in the Hasmonean period, in the mass conversions of the neighboring Idumeans and Itureans to Judean citizenship. So Judaism was a matter of citizenship rather than of ethnos. He goes on to say that a secondary effect of this political change was a religious one in the same period when we began to see stories of individual Gentiles believing in the God of the Jews and so undergoing religious conversion. And that's an important point. This word became largely religious, which meant a conversion to Judaism. That's how it's defined today. Folks can convert to the religion to become a Jew. Now, I want you to see how we can make some distinctions even when the writers used these terms interchangeably. This comes from a book that was written in the 1600s by John Ogilvy. He's talking about the region, certain regions in Africa. It says many Jews are scattered over this region, some natives boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabiting both sides of the river Niger. Now, some would pronounce it the same way the N word is pronounced with the hard G. It says others are Asian strangers who fled thither either from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian or from Judea, wasted and depopulated by the Romans, Persians, Saracens, and Christians, or else such as came out of Europe, whence they were banished, out of some parts of Italy in the year 1342, out of Spain in the year 1462, out of the Low Countries in 1350, out of France in 1403, out of England in 1422. These all differ in habit and are divided into several tribes, having no dominion or kingdom, though both wealthy and numerous, but despised of all nations, and so abominated by the Turks that they are not admitted to be Mohammedans unless first baptized, and then no otherwise made use of than to receive their customs and gather in their taxes. Now, do you honestly believe that he was talking about folks with pale skin moving to this area referred to as Negro land in those days? And what would cause all of them to flee to West Africa in the 1400s? Can we just say transatlantic slave trade? They were trying to blend in with those who looked like them. Look at where the blue arrow is pointing, and you see the river he referenced. And it just so happens that right below it is the slave coast. Now, here's an older copy of the French map from the Library of Congress. I want you to look at that area where the blue arrow is pointing. And then listen to the summary information about this map. It says, as late as the Renaissance, European knowledge of Africa was largely limited to the Mediterranean and coastal areas. It was also still heavily influenced by classical sources. Between 1570 and 1670, the Dutch, who dominated European map making at the time, began translating reports from Portuguese sea captains as well as earlier North African sources to expand their knowledge of the continent. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the French Royal Academy of Sciences gave new impetus to the mapping of Africa. This 18th century map by Guillaume des Isles, one of the Academy's cartographers, is one of the most scientific portrayals of North and West Africa at the time. So de Isles almost certainly drew upon the Dutch compilations of classical, Arabic, and Portuguese sources, it says. It says he also tried to map information from more recent accounts by Jesuits and other missionaries onto grids measuring latitude and longitude. So he provided a detailed rendering of both the coastal trading networks and the interior lands known as Negrita. It says some believe, listen, that the Niger River is an arm of the Nile, and for that reason call it the Nile of the Negroes. Did you know that the river was also called the Nile of the Negroes? And it just so happens that in that same area, the Negro land area, around the Nile of the Negroes, we see Kingdom of Judah, also known as the Slave Coast. Why were they there? They had been chased out of Judea. Now, when you hear this quote from John Nutt in 1714, all of this will make sense. He said, Judaism was the religion of ancient Africans for a long time and succeeded by Christianity. It was succeeded by Christianity. But Mohammedanism prevailed in the 108th year of Hijrah when all the Jews, Christians, and professors of the African religion that could be found were put to death. Yet in process of time, their intestine quarrels made them neglect Muhammad's law and revolt from the Caliph of Baghdad, for which they were severely punished by the Mohammedan caliphs, who caused all their books to be burnt on suspicion that the knowledge of the arts and sciences prompted them to condemn Muhammad's laws. So our people were being oppressed by the Christian church and Muslims. But do you know who managed to escape the persecution and oppression? Certain Pharisees. So where did those Pharisees go after the destruction? They regrouped at Yavne, also known as Jabne or Jemniah, where they became the early rabbis. Let's look at this from Sepharia Library. It says, after the destruction, a man named Yohanan Zakkai moved the Sanhedrin to Yavne, and it became an important center of Jewish learning, rabbinic scholarship, and the development of rabbinic Judaism. And Jewish and Judaism would certainly be appropriate to use here to distinguish those of this sect. Yohanan supposedly requested that Vespasian allow them to migrate to that area, and he is credited with ensuring the survival of the Jewish scholarship and leadership. Our question should be, why were the Romans so gracious to this particular group? I think we know why. Because their fate was entirely different from what happened to other Judeans. Listen to the quote. It says, Vespasian then said to Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, I will be going to Rome to accept my new position, and I will send someone else in my place to continue besieging the city and waging war against it. But before I leave, ask something of me that I can give you. So it says that he replied by saying, Give me Yavne and its sages or teachers, and do not destroy it, and spare the dynasty of Rabban Gamliel, and do not kill them as if they were rebels. And lastly, give me doctors to heal Rabbi Zadok. So the Pharisees escaped the destruction. They reorganized at Yavne, and their sages or teachers started to rebuild based on their oral and written traditions. They produced the Mishnah and eventually the Talmud. What's the difference between the Mishnah and the Talmud? Well, they serve different purposes. The Mishnah is a collection of Jewish oral traditions and laws. The Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah that includes additional discussions, interpretations, and debates by their rabbis. Now, this part is key. The Talmud is much larger and more expansive than the Mishnah, and it is considered a central text in Jewish scholarship and religious practice. Both texts are studied and revered by Jewish scholars and practitioners, but the Talmud is often seen as a more comprehensive and authoritative source of Jewish law and tradition. Shea J.D. Cohen is quoted as saying this in his academic study. He said, after 70 CE, the rabbis gathered in Yavne and launched the process which yielded the Mishnah approximately 100 years later. He also notes that most of these rabbis were Pharisees, even if they did not always self-identify that way. We're going to look at this information from Alexandria. This comes from the works of Josephus, The Wars of the Jews. Josephus says, there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews. The followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, of the second, the Sadducees, and the third sect, which pretends to a severer discipline, are called Essenes. These last, as in the Essenes, are Jews by birth, and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. Why would he make a distinction here and say that the Essenes are Jews by birth? Why didn't he say that about the Pharisees and Sadducees? What we see is that out of the 3 groups, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, the Pharisees survived and the other 2 did not. The Sadducees basically disappeared after the temple was destroyed because they were temple-centered, priesthood-centered. So they lost their entire institutional base after 70 AD. The Essenes were already a scattered group, and they also disappeared from history. And then we have the Pharisees. They remained, but they're not called that today. The Pharisaic Judaism became rabbinic Judaism. Like Edom and Rome, they were able to morph into something else. It is said that it is because they were centered around the synagogue and not the temple. They placed more emphasis on the oral law. They were adaptable. They had teachers, schools, and lay support, and they were able to reorganize and transition into something else. They also began to build synagogue communities across the Roman Empire. So their teachers moved into Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria. They also went into Turkey, Rome, and Italy. We're going to look at this. It's called the Talmud, an analytical guide to its history and teachings. And this is going to give you an example of how the Pharisees reinterpreted various passages of Scripture. It says, when the Almighty sent forth the Israelites from Egypt and delivered them from bondage into freedom, he said, the Jews are the servants of God. Therefore, they must not be sold as slaves to slaves. So Jacob ben Zebid says, why is a slave liberated when he loses an eye or a tooth as a result of a beating at the hands of his master? Because Ham, the son of Noah, was cursed to become a slave as a result of sinning against his father with his eyes and teeth. That is, with his vision and his speech. Therefore, the slave is freed of the curse of servitude when his master knocks his eye or tooth out. You all, what in the world does this have to do with Ham? Not only that, the scripture never said that Ham was cursed. This comes from Posen Library. It's entitled Rabbinic Authority After the Fall of the Temple. It says, in the aftermath of any major change or upheaval, familiar supports and routines disappear amid enormous loss. But there are also new opportunities. Ancient Jews face the challenge of rebuilding Jewish life and their relationship with God without the temple. The rabbis represent one group that responded to this upheaval, creating new traditions that balanced continuity with the world of the temple and practices that fit a temple-less reality. It says the rabbis basically redefined the very idea of Torah. Torah became a multi-layered concept that included not only scripture but also oral traditions and ongoing interpretation. In their view, there were now two Torahs, the written Torah of scripture and the oral Torah passed through generations of sages. It is also important for us to know that even though there were impostors and wicked religious leaders in the land among the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, there were also certain priests from the lineage of Aaron who were walking uprightly before the Most High. Zacharias was one of them. Let's look at this from Luke 1:5-11. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the division of Abijah. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before Yah, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Most High, blameless. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well advanced in years. So it was that while he was serving as priest, before Yah in the order of his division. According to the custom of the priesthood, his lot fell to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Most High, and the whole multitude of the people was praying outside at the hour of incense. Then an angel of the Most High appeared to him, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Now let's also note that the Sadducees were a priestly sect, but they rejected the oral law, angels, and the resurrection of the dead. So it's not a coincidence that an angel just happens to appear to Zechariah as he's performing his priestly duties. It's also not a coincidence that it is telling us that he was from the order of Abijah. Let's learn a little more about that priestly division. It says the order of Abijah is the 8th of the 24 priestly divisions established by King David, playing a significant role in the temple service and biblical history. So here's the historical context. The order of Abijah is one of the 24 divisions of priests known as Mishmarot that were organized by King David to facilitate the orderly performance of priestly duties in the temple. This division is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 24:10, which states, "The 7th to Hakaz, the 8th to Abijah." Each division was responsible for serving in the temple for 1 week at a time, twice a year, in addition to major festivals. So again, there was a mixed multitude in the land. Some of our people were walking uprightly before the Most High, and others were not. But we can certainly see why Messiah said this. Indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. He also said that we would know them by their fruit. Thus far, we see how Edom used various tactics to survive after his kingdom was destroyed. We also see how the teachings of the Pharisees laid the foundation for rabbinic Judaism. Their legacy is embedded within the religion itself. We're going to end it there. If this message has been a blessing to you, remember to like, hype, and share. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.